Fine.
Hello everybody, it is 3:30, which of course means it is time for one of our afternoon STEM shows here at the Headwaters Science Center. My name is Ryan, I'm one of the educators here, and what these shows are most days, or what's our schedule right now, Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We are currently scheduling our streams every week. And basically what this is one of the educators here at the Science Center comes out in front of you, we talk about some sort of science-y topic with you. It changes week to week, day to day, interpreter to interpreter. So you tune in one day, you're going to see something completely different from what you're going to see the next time you tune in. So keep tuning in. Eventually something's bound to be interesting for you. But as I often do on Fridays, I'm doing a follow-up show of sorts. And so if you tuned in on Wednesday, you would have seen Lee reading a couple of books, specifically about bears. Bears. And so, like I said, as I often do, a lot of times I'll take something that I notice about one of Lee's books, and I'll do a follow-up show about it, kind of talking about one of the concepts in it a little deeper, go a little more scientific on it. And if you want to go back and watch Lee's reading, you can find it on our YouTube channel. It'll be called, Rabbit Reading, whatever that day would have been. But specifically, I wanted to talk about this book. This book is called Winnie, and basically what it is it's kind of the true backstory of Winnie the Pooh. Because it turns out Winnie the Pooh, long-standing beloved children's book character, started out as a real bear. He was a bear that was originally from Canada and was adopted by a soldier in the Canadian Army, and eventually winds up in the London Zoo after spending a time traveling with the Canadian Army during World War I. And so specifically what I wanted to kind of talk about here is sort of this process of how an animal like Winnie ends up in human care, what that is like from the animal's perspective, why that is something you generally don't want to be doing, and then talking a little bit about sort of how animals that we do have in human care kind of end up there. Whether that be here, whether that be, the pet that you might have around your house, how they end up there. And so generally the story with Winnie here is that Winnie's mother was shot and killed by a hunter, and then the hunter noticed the cub after having already shot the mother, took it in, and then ends up selling him to, like I said, this soldier at a train station in Canada. The name Winnie is short for Winnipeg because that's where the unit was from. And one of the things that is kind of understated in this, but I think is really important to remember about, this, spoiler alert on this, it ends up going pretty well for Winnie. Like, this isn't a story that necessarily frames taking an animal out of the wild and, caring for it in a very negative light, because it ends up going really well for this particular bear. But something that I really want to make sure is understood with, kind of going into this story a little bit, is that a big reason why it goes well for Winnie, a big reason why this works, is because this guy who happens to buy Winnie is a veterinarian. He is somebody who very specifically is very trained for taking care of animals. Specifically, he's a guy who was taking care of horses during World War I, so he's even trained and equipped for taking care of large mammals. If some other random schmuck at the train station had happened to purchase Winnie, it probably does not go nearly as well, because caring for a bear is a major challenge. Not only in that, knowing what to feed and how to take care of a bear is a challenge, but even just having the space and means to do it is a major challenge. I mean, we notably don't have anything anywhere near that size here at the Science Center, just because even just providing the space and food needs for it is something that, we couldn't do realistically as an institution of our size, let alone you at your house. And so, it talks about taking it in, like I said, as a veterinarian, feeding it condensed milk, and eventually training it to do kind of, bear things, learning how to climb and learning how to kind of root around and find food and things like that. And even with that, even with Harry, I think is the guy's name, yeah, Harry, taking specific care to try and kind of encourage Winnie to do things that a bear would do in the wild. In the end, Winnie still doesn't end up getting released back into the wild. Winnie ends up in a zoo. Because as is pretty much always the case, if you take an animal in at a young age and attempt to raise it as a human, it is going to learn to associate humans with that care, with food specifically. And you take an animal like a bear that is very acclimated to being around humans and release it in the wild, what's the first thing it's going to do? Go and find more people. And a phrase that you'll often hear Angie, the woman who does our bird talks here, say is that when wild animals have encounters with humans, it often always goes bad for the wild animal. And so if you're releasing a bear in the wild that's acclimated to like taking food from and being near humans into the wild, and the first time it walks up to a human, humans tend not to trust bears very much when they get close to them. And like I said, it likely would not have gone well for Winnie. And so this is a situation where it went about as right as it possibly could. I would never recommend anybody take any animals out of the wild and try and care for them yourself. One, because like I said, typically it's not going to be great for the animal to do that. It's going to be challenging for you to take proper care of that animal. And then two, it in most cases is even like illegal to do that. And so, that being said, we have a number of animals around here at the Science Center that are wild-born animals that we have here. I mentioned Angie with our birds, for example. We have 4 wild-born raptors here at the Science Center. We have 2 owls, a hawk, and a falcon, and every one of them were born in the wild. How did those birds end up here? They got injured out in the wild due to some encounter with humans, basically. And so in that scenario, what happens is those birds get taken to a rehabilitator, they get taken to a vet who tries to like get them back up and running and release them back into the wild. But in the event that that can't happen, they end up in places like this where they get used in educational contexts. You sitting there at home would need to go through a lot of paperwork before you could keep an owl like we keep Oswald, who you may be hearing on the microphone every once in a while here. We have a litany of paperwork that we have to go to have that owl. And like I said, even while we have him here, we can't treat him like a pet. He is one who still has some of those kind of wild tendencies to him. He's very territorial in his space. I can, for personally, like I feed him sometimes and I can't go into his enclosure with him. Some people can, I can't. He doesn't trust me enough to go into his enclosure. He literally attacks me before I even try and get in there. And that's, that wild tendency of wanting to be territorial and control a space that he has. And so that's a tendency that you see in animals that are not domesticated, is they still retain behaviors, most notably like fear, basically, in regards to humans, that prevents them from being good as pets, basically. But we have a number of other critters around the Science Center that are wild-born or wild-caught that we bring in ourselves. One example that I have with me today is Eddie. Eddie is our American toad, and you might recognize him from down in Critter Corner. He lives kind of over by the bog tank, is where he's normally hanging out. And Eddie is interesting in that the reason he ended up here is because he basically wasn't hibernating a couple years ago. He found his way into a former staff person's garage during the winter rather than going into hibernation like a toad normally would. And so rather than having him just freeze to death in the winter, we collected him and we brought him in, and he's been living, like I said, over in Critter Corner for the last 2 years at this point. And even for something as simple as, a toad, which I'm sure everybody around Bemidji has encountered, a toad that probably looks just like Eddie 100 times in your life, we couldn't keep Eddie if we didn't have the proper permits for him. We have to take documentation of Eddie and give that to the DNR every single year for it to be legal for us to keep him. And that's true for any of our animals. We have several fish that we have netted out in the wild and we keep here, and we're allowed to do that because of our educational context that we're working in here. Because we're an institution that does environmental education, we are allowed to do this by virtue of filling out all the right paperwork to do it. On the far kind of opposite side of things, and we're kind of getting into our tame versus domestic conversation here, we have a very, very domesticated critter here, something that you very much do not need like a permit to buy or keep or have. You can just go and purchase one of these. You probably find them for free. We got ours for free. We don't have any specific documentation on this. Somebody just donated this to us. We were looking for some furry things and happened to have somebody reach out to us at the right time, and we took in a couple of guinea pigs here. So this is one of them. And like I said, this is a great example of something that is very, very much a domestic animal. And when I say a domestic thing versus a tame thing, we'll get into kind of what the actual definition is for that. It's a little hairy, to be honest. Like if you're really getting into the trying to come up with a real definition for what's a domestic thing versus what's a tame thing. But guinea pigs would be something that is pretty universally considered to be domestic. In fact, guinea pigs are so much domesticated that there literally isn't even a wild equivalent of this anymore. You can't go out in the wild and find this species of guinea pig. There are rodents that exist in South America that are generally considered to be very closely related to guinea pigs that are probably, what they were initially bred from. But at this point, you're looking up like the scientific names of these things. Domestic guinea pigs have a different scientific name than what any wild animal has now, which is different than a lot of things. We were talking about before we went live here, another example of an animal that very much shows very typical like domestic tendencies here at the Science Center are our rabbits. But despite how different our rabbits look from like the rabbits that are, in your backyard, they actually are considered to be the same species still as, not the ones that we have around here, but a certain species of wild rabbit that exists in Europe. And so they have been brought into human settlements and bred for, domestic purposes. But they are, like I said, still considered to be the same species. And so I think that's what we want to get into here, is talking about sort of what's this difference between a tame animal and a domesticated animal. And so in the situation with Winnie was a American black bear, and Winnie would be considered an animal that is tame. Winnie was an animal that was born in the wild, brought in and cared for by humans, and kind of got acclimated to humans. But the extent of his interaction with humans was strictly after being born, basically. An animal that is domesticated, generally what you'll hear as a definition for domestication is a domestic species is one where humans have gained a significant amount of control over their breeding over multiple generations. And so you start seeing physical changes happen, so you start seeing the appearance of traits that wouldn't be advantageous for surviving in the wild. You also start seeing like behavioral traits change. And so I would mention something like you tend to see kind of that instinctual fear of humans going away. Tends to be something that gets bred for in domestic things. And so the question is kind of where do you draw that line of at what point, how many generations deep do you need to go before you say, how many generations of toads do I need to breed before this goes from being a wild animal, a wild tamed animal, to being a domestic version of that? Like I said, it's a line that is not very well defined. It's kind of an arbitrary thing in a lot of ways, to be honest.
Like many things in biology.
Yeah. And so, I have a couple more critters with me here that are some examples of maybe some of these middle grounds here. Keep your lid on you for now. So, this is Rosie. Rosie is a common snapping turtle. And Rosie's been with us here at the Science Center for about 3 years. And I will say they're not super common in the pet trade, but there is a pet trade for snapping turtles. People do keep and breed and sell snapping turtles as pets. It's a, like I said, not the most common thing in the world, but it's very much a thing that exists. And so, like I said, the question would be, does the fact that there is a pet trade for this exist that, has had, like I said, a pretty noticeable, control over the breeding of this species in certain contexts for a long time, means snapping turtles are domesticated? I don't have a good answer for you on that, because, like I said, there doesn't seem to be a really widely agreed upon answer for it. I would say that Rosie in particular is one where there is not really a question as to whether or not she is domesticated, because Rosie happens to be a wild-born turtle. She was born in the wild, she was brought in literally the day she hatched. She's lived with people since pretty much the day after she was born. Well, I guess the day she was born. She's been here since the day after, but she got collected the day she was born. Has been living with people her entire post-hatch life. Well, like I said, there's been no part of her that has been genetically controlled by humans at any point. So there's not really any argument to be made that, she in particular is a domestic animal. But, like I said, there are snapping turtles out there that have been bred by humans for generations and generations and generations now. And so the question would be, would you consider those to be domestic animals? And I said there's not a great answer for that. Scooch over one more thing here. And now we'll kind of go into kind of a similar but opposite problem, where this is Amanda. Amanda is a spiny-tailed lizard, or a Uromastix, you'll hear them called a lot of the times. That's the genus name for this is Uromastix. A lot of times you'll hear them called that. And Uromastices are interesting because they are just very, very recently kind of come into the pet trade. Like, people have only been keeping these for maybe 20 years total. But Amanda was born in human care. She came to us from a breeder. Her parents were very likely born in human care. Her parents' parents were very likely born in human care. But there is a much smaller, much less well-established breeding industry for spiny-tailed lizards than there are for snapping turtles. And so what you're seeing here is that, like, even if a species maybe has been bred for human use, there can still be, you know, wild versions of this that are not domesticated. There can still be, you know, questions about to what degree or if they are at all domesticated. And so I think a lot of the times, and it gets treated very much as like a binary thing. Either you're domesticated or you're not domesticated. And I don't think that is necessarily a very useful way to think about it. Because certain animals are going to be easier to domesticate than others. Certain ones are going to be more easily domesticated. It's going to take shorter amounts of time to domesticate. You know, we talk about it as a thing of, like, you know, generations of breeding to breed new traits in. Generation lengths are different from species to species. You know, something like a, you know, guinea pig or a toad, you know, it only takes them a couple years to be able to reproduce, and then they can reproduce again and again. Or bunnies, they're ready to breed within, like, their first year. You know, you can go through probably dozens of generations of bunnies in the same time it would take you to do that same number of generations in, you know, to do one generation in, you know, if you want to domesticate like elephants, for example, something that has a much longer gestation period, can't reproduce until much later in its life. You know, you can say we've been living with elephants for however many hundreds of years, but how many generations is that compared to, you know, even if we've only, I mean, bunnies have been domesticated for 2,000 years or so at this point, but in that same span, there's been a lot more generations of bunnies. There's been a lot more breeding that has happened with bunnies than there has been with elephants, even if they've been living kind of in close proximity to humans for a similar amount of time.
Can I ask a question, Ryan?
Yeah.
So, first thing I'm wondering is are there like physical or like visual differences between the spiny tail even this quick after they've been domesticated or partially domesticated?
Yeah, I don't know specifically with the spiny tail, like how different Amanda looks compared to a wild one. A similar, but like just kind of a bit further along in the kind of domestication path that, again, you can see here at the Headwaters Science Center would be bearded dragons, where you can look at bearded dragons. Like I said, they're more well established in the pet trade. They've been, put her lid back on because she's trying to climb out. More well established in the pet trade. They've been, you know, selectively bred for longer, and you can look at a domestic bearded dragon and a wild bearded dragon and see pretty immediate, pretty obvious differences. Things like, you know, obviously we have Pogo here, who is a very different color than what any wild bearded dragon would be, but even things like the layout of the scales on the back is different in domestic ones compared to wild ones. The size of the scales on the back are different because it makes them softer, basically, than the wild ones. And this is a thing that you tend to see in a lot of domesticated critters is... there's a specific term for it, but you basically see just like an overall like rounding and softening of them aesthetically.
I think it might be feminization, right? I mean, I think they gain more estrogen, right?
That's not what I'm thinking of. No.
Oh, no. I've heard of that.
Yeah, there is a specific like term within it that describes sort of just like the general aesthetic that changes with domestic things, the traits they adopt being. They say ones that are generally not conducive to surviving in the wild, but and it doesn't necessarily always equate to, like I said, like a rounding, like thing like the bunnies having floppy ears is something, like floppy ears is something that you see in a number of different things that get domesticated, or just like floppiness, you know, like you don't see dogs with floppy ears in the wild. You don't see rabbits with floppy ears in the wild.
And doesn't that have something
the killer whale like fin thing is another one that you don't see in the wild. They all have vertical standing dorsal fins.
Isn't that due to a reduction of testosterone?
I don't know.
At least that's what I've been told by Carl. But
yeah, I mean it could be. I'm always a little leery of those types of allegations, just because there's sociology stuff that gets tied into that.
Oh, really? I was thinking it's more of a cartilage thing, I think. But the other question I had was, do you think that there's a difference for, like, in terms of, like, gray matter, mass, like, so, like, a horse versus an elephant, like, if you've ever heard, like, an elephant, you can't make an elephant charge into battle, but you can make a horse charge into battle. Is that just purely because the gestation period is longer on an elephant, or do you think it has something to do with their, like, differing levels of intelligence between animals?
Probably not exclusively a gestation period thing, but the common, like, accepted kind of way this works is that you basically can breed behavior into animals given a long enough time. How challenging that is, how difficult that is, because a lot of times it is predicated on doing things that that animal already does. So you'll see, like, goats, for example, being something that gets domesticated, like, independently in a bunch of places because they're just stupid easy to domesticate.
Right.
Because they're like, yeah, we like to stand around and eat grass and, like, be in herds.
So it's like, if you want to do that for
us, you can just move the whole pile around easily because they just follow each other.
Yeah.
Natively, like. It's the same thing with, like, a lot of cattle and things like that. Like, it's all built around their natural tendency to herd, and I would bet that horses probably are in that same vein, where you get a bunch of horses running and they just all run with each other.
Right.
Like, you don't gotta... You can get horses to run by just getting one horse to run. And then
because they just have, like, a herding mentality.
Yeah.
Well, don't elephants also sometimes behave in that way?
Elephants do herd as well. And so, like I said, I'm not, in this particular instance, I'm not 100% sure of, like, how that works. I said that I know something specifically with elephants is that, like, the long gestation period is tough because, like I said, doing
it's just hard to manipulate,
and just, like,
their
generally
genes.
Like, lower population is tough too because you have a smaller pool to select from when you're trying to select for your next generation.
They're just sort of an unwieldy animal to try to domesticate.
Yeah, it's hard to keep them because they need a ton of food. They take up a ton of space. Like, you know, they can't eat grass. Is a big part of it. And you'll notice that a lot of the things.
Wait, they can't. They're browsers.
Yeah, they're tree browsers. A lot of the things that you see get domesticated really quickly, really often, really widespread domestication, are stuff that you can just, like, turn loose in a field and let munch on grass.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that's easy.
Yeah.
Like,
interesting.
If it's a thing you have to be, like, specifically, like, shoveling food into its mouth all the time, you're a lot less likely to keep it because it's more work than it's worth.
Right.
You know, you're sacrificing more food than what you're getting back out of it, benefits-wise.
Pigs,
like I said,
you're like coming from hogs, they can just eat, like, literally anything you throw at them. Or
pretty much. Like, the easier it is to feed them, the
more likely
keep track of them, the more likely it is that they're going to get domesticated. Is the tendency.
Interesting.
And like I said, it's not necessarily there is an element of it of just, like, how easy is it to domesticate them, but, like we're kind of touching on here, there's also an element of how valuable is it to domesticate them as far as, like, the animal's usefulness to humans versus how much effort you have to put into it. There's more than one factor in that equation that you gotta think about. That's why you tend to not see, like big cats domesticated too. They take a ton of food, and the food they take is
hard to get.
Is hard food to get. And the reason the carnivores we do tend to take are ones that can provide some other service for us. You know, we bring cats in because they're good at controlling other pests.
And we didn't
bring
feed
dogs
them,
in because
right?
we can use them to hunt stuff.
Like cats originally we didn't feed. They would just hunt the pests around the camp, and then dogs are omnivores and also are very, very useful and are very readily associated into a different type of pack, basically, because they're already social animals.
They inherently work well in packs, and they pack hunt specifically. So they join in on our pack. Well, we're pack hunting. We're pack hunters as well. It's what we do. It's what we are built to do is pack hunt, basically.
So that's
And so we integrate in with
out,
each other. The
basically.
dogs do their thing, we do
Yeah.
our thing, and both parties benefit. It's a mutualist thing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I said, you can't do that with a jaguar.
Yeah. It's interesting.
But anyway, I don't know how long I've been talking. It feels like a while. That felt like it was a long one, kind of.
Almost a half an hour.
Great. Well, thank you guys for watching. The Headwaters Science Center is open 7 days a week, or we're open 9:30 to 5, Monday through Saturday, and then we are open from 1 to 5 on Sundays, so come by anytime. If you come by on Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, or Friday at 3:30, we very likely will be shooting one of these. In fact, you might be able to hear people out on the exhibit floor while I've been talking here. There are people here. There are people in the audience who have been lobbing me questions here. So yeah, if you happen to come by and we're shooting one of these shows, absolutely come by. And there's usually chairs around. You can take a seat. You can toss a question to whoever is up here. We're happy to have an audience.